The air in Whitehall was different now. Not the warm, perfumed breath of a royal palace in winter. No. This was a heavier air, slow-moving and stale, as if reluctant to pass through the rooms it once danced in. The stone corridors, once alive with the shuffle of boots and the rustle of silk, had grown cautious. Servants padded lightly, voices lowered, as though every sound might wake something they feared. And then, there was the smell. It came first in whispers, drifting in from the king's private chambers. A faint sourness carried on the draught between door and threshold. At first, it was ignored, explained away as the odor of medicines or damp bandages. But the weeks dragged on, and the smell thickened, became a presence. It was no longer the sweet musk of incense in chapel halls, nor the sharp tang of gunpowder from the tilt-yard. It was the metallic breath of rot. It crept through the palace like a herald of bad news. Through tapestries meant to keep the cold out, down stairwells, across marble floors polished for no eyes to see. The scent clung to those who left his chambers, clinging to hair, to skin, to their very clothes, as if the decay itself was hunting for escape. The servants knew its source. Everyone did. The king's leg, the wound that would not close, had begun to fester in earnest. It had been an old injury, born years ago from a jousting accident when Henry was still a man of war, still able to mount a horse with the grace of a knight from legend. Back then, he had been broad-shouldered and sun-browned, his body a fortress of muscle. But that day on the tilt-yard had changed everything. His armor had saved his life, but not his flesh. Beneath the plates, a deep bruise had turned to an ulcer, and the ulcer had turned to a sentence he could never outlive. Now the leg swelled and split under its bandages. The skin mottled, yellowed at the edges, purple where the blood pooled, black where it had begun to die. The wound oozed in a slow, stubborn rhythm, as though the leg itself was trying to bleed the king away, drop by poisoned drop. Physicians attended him daily, armed with poultices of wine, vinegar, and herbs, ground into bitter-smelling paste. They muttered in Latin about corrupt humors and blocked vapors, while their hands trembled, for they knew the truth. Their work was no longer to heal, only to delay. Henry Tudor, once a towering figure astride a destrier, now lay swollen and pale in his bed, each breath dragging from him as if the air were lead. The great canopy above his head, embroidered in gold and crimson, seemed to sag in sympathy. His frame, once carried by the strength of a warrior, had collapsed into his own flesh. His chin sank into his chest when he slept, and when he woke, it was with a sound. Not the sigh of an old man, but the rasp of a forge bellows that had not been tended in years. Those who entered his chambers were schooled in the art of deception. They bowed low, smiled as though nothing was amiss, and spoke of the weather, the hunt, or foreign affairs. But their eyes flickered, unable to ignore the truth. Here lay a king dying from the inside out. Henry himself refused the word dying. He was not the kind of man to admit defeat, not to France, not to Rome, and certainly not to his own body. In his mind, he was still God's chosen ruler, anointed by holy oil, wearing the crown by divine right. Death could not simply arrive and take him. No, if it wanted him, it would have to fight. And fight he did in his own way. Each morning he demanded his counsel be brought to his bedside. Maps were unfurled across the coverlet, sealed documents presented for his trembling signature. The king, who could barely lift his head, still issued orders with the voice of command, as though volume alone might drive the rot from his bones. But the defiance cost him. By the time the last counselor had withdrawn, Henry's breathing was ragged, his skin slick with sweat. The smell in the room grew heavier in those moments, as if it fed on his exertion. The palace itself seemed to respond to his decline. The fires burned hotter, the candles lower. The shadows stretched long across the floor, swallowing the edges of the tapestries and pooling in the corners like ink. Even the sounds had changed. The clatter of boots and the clink of goblets had faded to the soft creak of wood and the occasional cough of a guard standing too long in the cold. And always there was the smell, growing bolder, as if aware that no one dared name it aloud. It lingered during meals, when the king picked half-heartedly at platters of roast meat and sugared fruit. It clung to the air during prayers, when the chapel's incense fought a losing battle. It drifted into the bedchambers of courtiers who lay awake at night, wondering if they would see another dawn with Henry still breathing. For all the outward signs, it was what could not be seen that most unsettled the court. The man before them was not simply a sick king. He was a living contradiction. This was Henry VIII, the same man who had torn England from Rome, who had married 6 times, who had stared down armies and popes alike. Now confined to a bed, his kingdom ruled from between sweat-soaked sheets. And yet, for all his weakness, there remained in him a core of stubborn majesty. His voice still carried, his temper still flared, and when he looked upon his courtiers with those pale, sharp eyes, they still bowed lower, as though the man they remembered was still there. This was the paradox: the body in decline, the will unbroken. But the court knew what Henry would not say aloud. This was the beginning of the end. The air was thick with it, the way a room feels before a storm breaks. The heaviness, the waiting, the certainty that something vast and irreversible was about to happen. They did not yet know how strange, how grim those final weeks would become. They did not yet see the webs of treachery already spinning in the shadows, but they could smell it. Everyone could smell it, and the smell was only going to grow stronger. Outside, January snow pressed against the palace windows, muffling the world beyond. But within Whitehall, the cold was not the kind that could be driven out by fire. It was the cold of a winter that had settled inside the king himself, a winter from which there would be no thaw. Outside, January snow fell in a silence so deep it seemed to swallow the world. London lay smothered beneath its white shroud, rooftops sagging under the weight, streets narrowed by drifts. Even the river slowed, ice blooming at its edges like frostbite creeping across pale skin. In the city, people huddled close to their hearths, muttering about shortages, about illness, about omens. The bells of St. Paul's rang slower in winter air, a sound that reached the palace gates as a distant, mournful toll. Inside Whitehall, the cold was not the kind that could be burned away. Fires roared in every brazier, flames licking at their iron mouths until the metal glowed red. Servants heaped logs into the great hearths, scattering embers onto rushes already browned by the season. And yet, beneath the heat, the stone walls kept their chill. They exhaled it slowly, constantly, as though the palace itself had a will, and that will was to keep its master cold. Tapestries hung heavy over the walls, their scenes of hunting parties and jousts frozen mid-movement, the bright threads dulled by years of smoke. The thick cloth was meant to keep out the drafts, but it also smothered the air, trapping the mingled scents of burning pine, tallow candles, and something darker. The sour, metallic tang drifting from the royal apartments. It was a warmth without comfort, like a crypt sealed against the living. In the king's bedchamber, the atmosphere was heavier still. Here the heat made the skin prickle, and the breath lingered too long in the air, curling into pale ghosts before dissolving. The windows were shuttered, their wooden frames swollen from the damp. Above the bed, the great canopy loomed, its gold-threaded fabric draped thick as funeral cloth. The room was bright with candlelight, but even that brightness seemed tired, as though the flames themselves were growing old in service. Henry lay encased in furs and silks, a mound of cloth that shifted only when he did. The fur at his collar framed his swollen face like the edging of a reliquary, as though he were some sacred relic meant to be gazed upon, not touched. The weight of the coverings pressed into him, holding his limbs still. But it was not the bedclothes that kept him there. It was his own body. The king who had once ridden stallions across muddy tilt yards, who had leapt into rivers during the hunt, who had danced until the court was breathless, could now barely sit upright without aid. His knees and ankles had thickened with fluid, his joints screamed when he shifted, and his legs, always wrapped, always hidden, ached constantly with the deep, bone-cold pain of old wounds gone rotten. When he reached for a goblet or rolled parchment, his hands emerged from the furs like pale birds from a nest, slow and deliberate, their veins raised against translucent skin. The palace, once a place he commanded, seemed to have turned against him. The halls he had strode now felt narrow, their shadows deeper, the air heavier. He could not ride to Greenwich, could not walk to the chapel without being carried in a chair. The sound of boots and hoofbeats outside his chamber was no longer the prelude to his arrival. It was the reminder that life beyond his room still went on without him. And the people. They had begun to speak of him differently. In public, the courtiers still called him Majesty, still bowed low enough to brush the floor. But in corners, in the echoing spaces behind closed doors, he had become the old lion, the great one brought low. Some whispered that God was taking his time with this king, drawing out his decline like a lesson. Henry did not leave his bedchamber willingly now. When he did, it was with spectacle, a calculated parade for the eyes of his court. He would be dressed in the richest velvets, his fur-lined robes clasped with jewels. His face would be painted with the faintest flush to disguise its pallor. 2 men would lift him into his chair, and 4 would carry him, their faces impassive, as if bearing a relic in procession. He would be set upon a dais in the council chamber, a map spread before him, or in the chapel, where the flicker of candlelight softened the lines of his face. In those moments, the king was still there. His voice could still carry, his commands still had the weight of law. But these appearances were brief, and when he was carried back to his bed, the truth followed. The show was for them as much as for himself. From his bed, he listened to the winter. He could hear the faint groan of the palace timbers as frost worked its way into the beams. He heard the muffled clatter of servants carrying coal and firewood, the drip of melting ice from the eaves. Sometimes, late at night, he imagined the snow piling higher and higher against the walls until even Whitehall was buried, a royal tomb in a city of tombs. The cold played tricks on him. It made the hours indistinct, the nights longer than the days. Dreams came more often, vivid and strange. Flashes of his youth, the ring of steel on steel, the warmth of a summer sun on the tilt yard. Then, just as quickly, the dreams would sour, turning to visions of faces he knew too well. Wives, allies, enemies, each frozen in the moment they had left him, each gaze heavy with unspoken judgment. Henry had always lived in the forward motion of power. The next treaty, the next marriage, the next victory. But now the forward path had narrowed to a single bed, a single room, a single winter. And with nothing left to chase, his mind began to turn backward. He remembered the hunts in Windsor Forest, the smell of horse and leather, the exhilaration of the chase. He remembered the banquets, the music, the laughter that rang off the rafters when he was young and feared nothing. But memory was treacherous. For every moment of triumph came another of loss. A wife sent away, a friend executed, a child buried. These memories pressed against each other like stones in a narrow wall, and behind that wall, the cold waited. The court tiptoed around him now, careful not to disturb the king's winter mood. Some brought gifts, bolts of warm cloth, rare wines, foreign delicacies. Others brought news from the city, carefully chosen to avoid subjects that might spark his anger, but nothing could fully thaw the frost that had settled inside him. There were days when he refused all visitors, the doors to his chambers barred from dawn to dusk. Inside, only the crackle of the fire and the slow, labored sound of his breathing filled the air. On those days, the palace seemed quieter than ever, as though holding its breath. Winter had always been the season of retreat, the time when armies camped, hunts were suspended, and the court huddled indoors to wait for spring. But for Henry, this winter was not a pause. It was a narrowing. The circle of his world had drawn so tight that he could measure it in the steps from his bed to the brazier. And somewhere beyond the snow, beyond the frost, the realm went on without him. Yet even in the stillness, the past would not rest. It came to him in dreams, in flickers of candlelight on shadowed walls, the faces of those who had shared his bed, his crown, and too often, his wrath. And as the cold gripped Whitehall, the king began to feel the first stirrings of something more dangerous than fever, the memory of his own guilt. Night was when the palace truly turned against him. The wind clawed at the shutters like some desperate thing trying to get in, rattling the glass in a thin, ceaseless tremor. The fire, once bright and fierce in the grate, burned low by midnight, its glow collapsing into embers that pulsed faintly. Like the dying heart of some unseen beast, the air thickened, heavy with the mingled scent of smoke, wool, and the faint iron tang from beneath his bandages. It was in these hours, when courtiers slept and the palace fell still, that the faces came. Not in dreams, but in that waking state where the mind wanders unchecked and shadows begin to seem alive. Catherine of Aragon came first, always first. She stood as she had in her youth, the Spanish princess brought to England to cement an alliance, proud and unshakable. Her eyes were dark and steady, the eyes of a woman who had endured humiliation without bending. He had sent her away in disgrace, stripped her of her title, denied her even the dignity of her name. She had died alone, banished to the damp stone halls of Kimbleton Castle. Her final letter to him, sealed with forgiveness he had never asked for. He told himself it had been necessary. England needed an heir, and she had failed him. But in the silence of the chamber, stripped of counsel and courtly formality, the truth pressed harder. Catherine had not failed him. She had simply refused to break for him. Anne Boleyn followed. She came not as the flirtatious courtier who had first caught his eye, but as the condemned queen walking to the scaffold. Her gown was deep black, her hair tucked beneath the coif she had chosen for that day. He could still see the last glance she had given him across the Tower courtyard. Not pleading, not weeping, but sharp and cutting, as though her eyes alone could strike him dead. Her death had been quick, too quick for the kind of justice she might have wanted. He had told himself she was guilty, of treason, of adultery, of the blackest sin against her king. Yet even now, the charges felt like parchment set aflame. They vanished the moment you looked too closely. Jane Seymour came next, though her presence was different. She had been the quiet one, the gentle one, the only wife to give him a son. She had died in the blood-soaked sheets of childbirth, her skin pale as linen, her lips whispering prayers that trailed into silence. He had mourned her openly, dressed in black for months, ordered a grand tomb for them both. But in the dark, she was not the serene queen of his grief. She was cold and wan, her eyes clouded with the unspoken truth that she had died to give him what no other had. Anne of Cleves came in a half-smile, the only one of the 6 who had survived him unscathed. She had been spared, yes, but only because he had mocked her instead. The Flanders mare, he had called her, behind closed doors, and in the ears of those who carried his words far. Their marriage annulled before it had even begun, her value reduced to that of a political pawn gone sour. Her ghost, if it could be called that, did not glare like the others. But her presence was a reminder of his cruelty when it was not cloaked in necessity. a cruelty born of ego, not strategy. Then Catherine Howard. She was always trembling, even in memory, barely more than a girl, with laughter like chimes in the wind, until the day he learned of her betrayals. She had run through the corridors of Hampton Court, screaming for an audience, for a chance to speak before he signed her death warrant. They had dragged her to the block instead, her youth spilling into the straw like any common traitors. She returned to him in the night as she had left the world, terrified, pleading, yet still carrying a spark of the life he had crushed. And last, Catherine Parr, the survivor, the one still breathing. She came not as a specter, but as a shadow in the corner of his room, her living presence beyond these walls, reminding him that his will could not touch every fate. She had outmaneuvered him, escaped the noose by wit and timing. And though she had outlived him in life, she was already haunting him in spirit. 6 wives, 6 fates, none untouched by his hand. In the daylight, Henry could justify them all. Catherine of Aragon, a political necessity. Anne Boleyn, a traitor. Jane Seymour, a saintly loss. Anne of Cleves, a misjudgment corrected. Catherine Howard, a dangerous deceiver. Catherine Parr, a loyal consort. But at night, the excuses soured. In the quiet, there was no parliament to agree with him, no council to echo his reasoning. There was only the slow, uneven beat of his heart and the knowledge that each face had once smiled at him, and that every smile had ended in fear or pain or both. The wind outside seemed to speak in a chorus of voices, though he knew it was only the rattling shutters. It was easy, in that half-light, to imagine them whispering to him, their words curling through the shadows like smoke. We remember. Henry did not confess, not to priests, not to God. Confession was for the weak, for those who believed in the mercy of a higher power. He believed in his own will, in the divine right that had placed the crown on his head. Yet even that belief, once unshakable, was beginning to feel brittle under the weight of his memories. Some nights, he tried to fight them. He would summon the fire higher, call for music to be played in the adjoining chamber, demand his servants read aloud from the chronicles of his victories. The noise would drown the silence for a time, but when the fire sank low and the readers' voices grew hoarse, the faces would return, patient as ever. The guilt was not the sudden blow of a sword. It was the slow tightening of a noose, and each night the rope drew a little closer. In these hours, the king's mind became a battlefield, not of steel and blood, but of memory and regret. And on this battlefield, there were no allies, no generals, no treaties, only the ghosts of women who had shared his throne and paid for it with their lives. Yet even with the faces pressing in from the shadows, Henry clung to the habits of kingship. He still wore the mask of command by day, still roared when crossed, still summoned his council as though nothing had changed, but his body had begun to betray him more openly now, and soon the man who had ruled by sheer presence would be unable to stand at all. The morning audiences had once been a sight to behold. Henry, broad-shouldered and upright in a gown of crimson velvet, would stride into the council chamber with the sun at his back. His boots rang against the stone, each step deliberate, each echo a reminder of who ruled this kingdom. Men rose as he entered, eyes following his every movement, lips ready with praise or deference. Those mornings were gone. Now, before the king could even greet the day, there was the ritual of rising, a slow, undignified ordeal that began with the groan of the bed ropes as 2 men leaned their weight into the task of hauling him upright. His breathing grew labored at the effort, his chest rising and falling as though he had just crossed a battlefield. A 3rd servant slid in, steadying the king's shoulders as they shifted him toward the waiting chair. It was a process measured not in minutes, but in winces. The legs that had once gripped a warhorse's flanks were mottled with purple veins, their shape lost beneath swollen flesh. The skin stretched tight, shiny, as though straining against the weight it bore. Beneath layers of linen bandages lay the sores, hidden from sight, but never from smell. The scent rose faintly each time the wrappings were changed, a whisper of rot beneath the sharp bite of vinegar and wine. In his youth, Henry's muscles had been iron. Now they had melted into heavy, unyielding mass. His arms still held some strength, enough to slam a hand on the armrest when anger took him. But his legs were strangers to him. Standing was no longer an act of will. It was an act of siege, a prolonged campaign against his own body, and one he rarely won. And yet, despite the pain, despite the indignity, he insisted on being seen. It was not vanity alone, though Henry had always been proud of his presence. It was survival. A king unseen was a king whose absence could be imagined. In the Tudor court, absence was as dangerous as treason. So the preparations were made. His gown was chosen with care. Always rich, always heavy with gold thread and ermine. Jewels were clasped at his throat, his fingers weighed with rings. His chair was draped in cloth of gold, the cushions fluffed, the footstool placed just so. 2 men would lift him from the bed to the chair, adjusting the folds of his robe so no one would see how his body sagged within it. When the courtiers entered, the performance began. Henry's voice, though sometimes slow to start, still had its thunder when he chose to use it. He would speak of past campaigns, the smoke of Flodden, the French banners at Boulogne, the great ships of his navy gliding like fortresses upon the sea. His hands would gesture wide, his eyes bright with the memory of battles where he had been more than just a name on a command. But the illusion was fragile. When the speeches ended, the slump returned. His shoulders curved inward, his chin sank toward his chest. And in those moments, the courtiers saw not the lion, but the shadow of him. Still dangerous, yes, but in a way that invited thought, calculation, the kind of danger that could be outlasted. The court was an animal that fed on fear. For decades, Henry had kept it well fed, with swift punishments, with sudden rages, with the heads of those foolish enough to believe themselves secure. Fear had been the leash that kept every man in his place. Now that leash was fraying. Men began to exchange glances in his presence, quick flickers of the eye that said more than any words could. Some smiled too easily, their deference exaggerated, as though already rehearsing the courtesy they would pay his successor. Others were quieter, watching, weighing. It was the subtle shifting of a tide, not yet enough to capsize the vessel, but enough to feel the pull beneath your feet. Henry sensed it. Perhaps that was why his tempers had grown sharper. He lashed out more quickly now, his words cutting, his punishments harsher in their swiftness. He dismissed men mid-audience, sent servants from the room for imagined slights, ordered council members to the farthest ends of the chamber as if distance itself could remind them of their place. But it was different than before. Once, his anger had been the storm. Now it felt like the wind before it, sharp, cold, and carrying the scent of something inevitable. The public appearances were rarer now, and so when they came, they were all the more orchestrated. In the chapel, his chair was placed on a dais beneath a canopy, the altar glittering before him. He would mouth the prayers, his lips moving to the familiar Latin, though whether he spoke them to God or to the congregation was unclear. His eyes often drifted toward the assembly, scanning faces, taking measure. In the council chamber, maps were laid out across the table before him, their corners weighted with silver inkwells. He would trace lines along the coasts, point to ports, name fortresses as though planning for campaigns he would never lead. The councillors leaned in, nodding, pretending this was the same king who had once commanded armies in the field. And maybe, for a few moments, it was. But when the last courtier had left, when the doors closed, the mask slipped. His breathing deepened into slow, heavy pulls. His hand sometimes trembled as it reached for the goblet. The servants moved in quickly then, lifting him back to his bed, wrapping him once more in fur and linen. These were the moments no one outside the chamber saw. The moments when the king's body was a prison and his throne nothing more than a chair that waited to be filled by another. Yet even here, in the dim silence of his private rooms, there was defiance. He would not yield, not to his courtiers, not to his body, not to the shadow of death that lingered at the edges of the firelight. Each morning, no matter how long it took, he would be dressed and placed before his court. The lion might limp, the lion might sag, but the lion would be seen. Still, the scent of weakness drew dangerous eyes, and in a palace where ambition was as constant as the tolling of the bells, dangerous eyes did not stay idle for long. The watchfulness of his counselors was no longer the attentiveness of loyalty. It was the vigilance of men measuring the moment to move. Conversations grew quieter as he approached, only to flare again the moment his chair was wheeled away. Alliances began to shift in corners and corridors. The lion could still roar, but some had begun to wonder whether the roar was only an echo. And then came the flies. First a few black specks against the gold of the chamber walls, then more, drawn to the leg that no cloth, no ointment, no prayer could heal. The court's whispers grew louder, their eyes sharper. Decay was no longer a secret hidden beneath fur and velvet. It had taken wing. It began with a single black speck drifting lazily through the candlelit air of the king's chamber. A stray fly was no cause for alarm in any other place. London was a city of stables, refuse heaps, and open drains, and flies were as common as dust. But here, in the heavily guarded, perfumed, and shuttered sanctum of the King of England, that lone intruder felt like a trespasser in a holy place. It circled once, twice, tracing slow spirals above the gold leaf of the canopy, and then vanished into the shadows of the rafters. The next morning, there were 3. By the week's end, they numbered in dozens. The flies came with the thaw. Outside, February's ice loosened its grip on the city. The river ran faster. The gutters brimmed with meltwater. The air softened, carrying with it the smells that winter had kept locked away. Refuse rotting in the streets, damp earth, the musk of livestock, and with the warmth, the flies awoke. At first, they clung to the upper corners of the king's chamber, resting on the carved moldings and the folds of velvet drapes. But they were not idle. They had found what they were looking for. When the king's wrappings were changed, the air thickened with the smell. Wine, vinegar, and herbal poultices tried to mask it, but beneath those sharper scents lay the deeper, unmistakable one. The sweet, cloying reek of flesh that had begun to turn. The ulcers on his legs, long hidden under layers of linen, were no longer content to remain out of sight. The sores had grown weeping and raw, their edges swollen, the skin around them mottled with angry purple. They oozed slowly, a constant seep that no cloth could drink up for long. And the flies. They came as if summoned. Drawn to the warmth, to the moisture, they landed directly on the exposed flesh as the wrappings were unwound. The physicians flinched, their gloved hands moving faster, trying to shoo them away without attracting the king's notice. But Henry noticed everything. The first time he saw one land, his voice cracked like a whip. The surgeon was berated until his ears burned red. Servants were sent scrambling for more vinegar, more wine, more sweet-smelling oils to drive the creatures off. A guard was posted at the chamber door with orders to kill any fly that dared enter. An order so absurd, it could only have been given by a man desperate to control what he could. But the flies did not obey decrees. They came back the next day and the next. Soon, the battle against them became a ritual. Servants stood at either side of the bed, waving long-handled fans until their shoulders ached. pages were sent for sprigs of rosemary and mint to be hung in the rafters. Physicians muttered about bad humors and the unclean air that seemed to breed them. The king's chamber began to feel less like a royal bedchamber and more like a sick room in some plague-struck quarter. The air heavy, the light dim, the constant buzzing filling every pause in conversation. The humiliation was worse than the pain. Henry's body, once the envy of Europe, had been a weapon, not just in war but in the games of seduction and dominance that ruled the court. He had been the Golden Prince, broad-shouldered and strong, the man who could lift a lance with ease and hold the gaze of any woman in the room. Now he lay captive to a bed while black-winged scavengers feasted openly on his rotting flesh. The shame a bit deeper than the ulcers. The flies were not discreet like the courtiers who hid their disgust behind careful smiles. They made their verdict plain. The king's body was meat, and they had come to take their share. Even the most loyal found it hard to look upon him now. Old friends lowered their gaze when they knelt beside the bed. Ambassadors from foreign courts pressed perfumed kerchiefs to their noses. Servants came and went quickly, their movements hurried, their eyes fixed anywhere but the bandaged legs. Henry felt their revulsion like a draft beneath the door. It seeped into the room, into his bones. And when he felt it, his temper flared. He began to punish more swiftly. The smallest error, a misplaced cup, a dropped napkin, a stammer in an address, could draw his wrath. Punishments were meted out, not for their severity, but for their speed. A servant dismissed from his post, a courtier stripped of a favor, a counselor sent from the room in shame. It was as if, in the face of his body's betrayal, Henry sought to prove that he still ruled the world outside his own skin. And yet, behind the anger was something quieter, something he did not voice aloud. The flies were not just a nuisance, they were a sign. In medieval superstition, flies in a sick room were a harbinger, not of illness, but of death. They were creatures drawn to what was already departing, feeding on the body even before the soul had left it. Henry had dismissed such talk in his youth, but now, lying in the stifling air of his chamber, he wondered if the flies knew something he did not. The buzzing became part of the palace's rhythm. It was there in the mornings, when the king's legs were unwrapped and cleaned. It was there in the afternoons, when he dozed in his chair, servants fanning him while the flies darted just out of reach. It was there at night, when the fires sank low and the shadows grew long, the sound carrying in the stillness like a memory you could not banish. Some nights, the king woke suddenly, certain he had felt the brush of tiny feet on his skin. The physicians assured him it was nothing, but in the morning, when the wrappings were changed, the truth was plain. The linen bore tiny specks where the flies had left their mark. It was an indignity no crown could shield him from. A king could command armies, break with Rome, send men to the scaffold on a whim. But he could not command the flies to leave him. And so, as spring crept closer and the swarm grew thicker, Henry's anger deepened into something heavier. It was no longer the sharp flare of temper, but the slow burn of a man watching his authority dissolve. Not in rebellion, not in treason, but in the relentless, indifferent hunger of nature itself. Beyond the chamber doors, the court could smell the change. The air in Whitehall carried whispers now, and not all of them were about the king's health. Behind the tapestries in the shadowed corners, another kind of feeding had begun, not by flies, but by men hungry for power. The corridors of Whitehall had grown quieter in recent weeks, but quiet did not mean stillness. The air seemed to hold a constant, low vibration, not of music or the bustle of servants, but of voices, low and quick, curling around corners like tendrils of smoke. This was the sound of politics in its most dangerous form, not shouted in the council chamber, but whispered where no herald would ever announce it. Beyond the guarded doors of the king's chamber, power was already shifting. They met in alcoves, beneath archways, and in the deep recesses between wall and tapestry, where the cold air moved like a slow breath. The tapestries, grand scenes of hunts and battles, became the screens behind which the real battles were fought. Figures leaned close, shadows bending together, eyes darting toward the door before a single word was exchanged. And in those tight spaces, the question passed like a coin from hand to hand. When would Henry die? It was the question no one asked aloud in the light, but all answered in their own way. Some prayed for more time, others prayed for the opposite. The king's body was failing in plain sight, but the exact moment his heart would surrender, that was the variable on which futures hung. Because the moment Henry VIII's breath left him, the kingdom would no longer belong to Henry at all. The factions were already sharpening their blades. The Seymours, family of young Prince Edward's late mother, Jane Seymour, stood poised to claim the regency. Edward was only 9 years old, a boy with a crown too heavy for his head. Whoever controlled Edward would control England. For the Seymours, this was not just inheritance, it was conquest. Others plotted for the return of the old faith, whispering of the days before Henry had broken with Rome. They imagined a Catholic restoration under Mary, his eldest daughter, a shift that could undo decades of religious upheaval. And then there were those who saw opportunity in chaos, men who had served Henry for years but owed no loyalty to his children. They looked past the succession entirely, weighing how to claim lands, titles, and influence while the throne stood in its most vulnerable moment. In the evenings, when the great fires burned low and the palace's long galleries were shadowed in candlelight, the walls themselves seemed to listen. Servants lingered near council rooms, their hands busy with needless tasks, ears tuned to every word that passed between noblemen. A single overheard phrase could fetch a month's wages if carried to the right ears, and there were always ears willing to pay. Spies moved quietly through the palace, not foreign agents, but Englishmen serving English masters. They carried scraps of conversations folded into their memories, traded over cups of wine in shuttered rooms. Sometimes it was truth, sometimes rumor. Sometimes the line between the two was blurred intentionally. The scent of ambition was as sharp as the smell from the king's chamber. Those who had once flinched at Henry's temper now spoke more freely in his absence. They measured one another with the same cold precision a butcher gives to a carcass, each man deciding which pieces to take when the division began. It was an open secret that the throne was slipping, not from the Tudor line, but from Henry's living grasp. The body in the bed might still draw breath, but the authority that once flowed from it was already pooling in the hands of others. Even the rhythm of the palace had changed. The formal audiences grew shorter. The king's orders, once absolute, now came filtered through his council, softened or reshaped before they left the chamber. Visitors to Whitehall noticed that certain courtiers seemed to speak for the king more often than the king spoke for himself. There was no proclamation, no open declaration of weakness, but the court understood. Power was moving, silently, like water finding a lower place. Behind the tapestries, the whispered bargains became bolder. Support the boy, and you'll have Calais. Back the Queen's claim, and the Abbey lands are yours. Stand aside now, and I'll remember your silence later. Promises were made that no one intended to keep. Threats were delivered in tones so polite they could almost be mistaken for compliments. In such whispers, men's fortunes rose and fell without a single sword being drawn. The king's own servants were not immune. The same hands that dressed him, brought him wine, and carried his letters also carried news. News about who visited, who lingered too long, who left too quickly. These scraps were currency in the underground market of influence, traded for protection, for gold, for the simple promise of survival in the storm that was coming. Some of those servants had begun to serve more than one master, and through it all, the man at the center, the one whose name still commanded armies, lay in his chamber, the buzz of flies in his ears, and the scent of vinegar and decay in his nostrils. He knew the game was being played beyond his door. He could feel the shift in the air when his counselors entered, the faint satisfaction in their eyes when they carried his commands out into the corridors, knowing they would shape them to their own ends. If his body had been strong enough, perhaps he would have crushed these whispers as he had crushed every rebellion in his reign. But the corridors had grown longer. The world outside his chamber was receding. The palace itself seemed to lean toward the future, leaving the king behind. Messengers came and went more often, their errands less about bringing word to Henry and more about delivering word from those who were already acting in his name. The council met without him, more than with him. Decisions were framed as temporary measures, but everyone knew some of them would never be undone. This was how a kingdom shifted hands, not with a single act, but with a slow series of small ones, each almost invisible, until the shape of power was entirely different. And in the stillness behind the tapestries, the whispers deepened. Each murmur carried the same unspoken truth. The crown would soon be without a voice to defend it. And when that moment came, it would not be a gentle passing. It would be a feeding frenzy. Bridge to Chapter 7. And still, within those guarded chambers, Henry clung to the one thing the whispers could not yet take: the sight of the crown itself, gleaming in the candlelight, as if daring anyone to try and lift it from his reach. The fever came in waves. It would rise without warning, drenching the king's skin in a sheen of sweat that smelled faintly of metal and vinegar. Then, as quickly as it came, it would sink back, leaving him shivering beneath his layers of furs. The physicians muttered about heat in the blood and blocked vapors, but Henry paid them no more heed than he did the sermons of his priests. Fever was an inconvenience, nothing more, and there was work to be done. For a man who could barely stand, his determination to rule remained unshaken. The bed became his throne. Maps were spread across the coverlet, their corners weighted with silver candlesticks. Some were of England, others of Europe. The wide seas, the jagged coasts of France, the distant lines of Scotland. His trembling hand traced borders and coastlines as if sheer contact could hold them in place. Documents were brought to him in bundles tied with ribbon. Royal proclamations, decrees, orders to his council, reports from the Navy, letters from ambassadors. Each was opened, read aloud, and signed with a quill that sometimes scratched the parchment too lightly, the ink fading before the words were complete. His signature, once a bold slash across the page, had grown smaller, more hesitant, but still it was his. He dictated commands in a voice that still carried the weight of authority, though each sentence was followed by a pause for breath. No one dared interrupt him. The counselors leaned in as he spoke, nodding in agreement to orders that could not be refused. The fever burned through his skin, but his eyes were sharp. It was as though he believed, or needed to believe, that every word he wrote, every seal he pressed into warm wax, was a stitch in the fabric of his life. If he stopped signing, if he stopped ruling, the fabric might tear. And always near the bed sat the crown. It rested on a low table beside him, its gold catching the flicker of candlelight, its gemstones casting small sparks of red and green into the dim air. Some swore that Henry looked at it more than he looked at the faces of his council. There were moments when his gaze lingered on it for so long that the room seemed to fall away. The murmuring voices, the rustle of parchment, even the sound of his own breathing, all faded beneath the steady gleam of the crown's presence. It was not the first crown he had worn, nor the only one in his possession, but it was the crown, the physical symbol of England's monarchy, the object in which the centuries of power, blood, and divine right were believed to reside. In the fever's haze, it seemed to change. It became more than metal and jewels. It became a living thing, jealous, restless, unwilling to pass to another head. Its arcs of gold curved like a predator's claws. The enameled fleur-de-lis seemed less like flowers and more like sharp teeth. It was watching him, waiting, not as a comfort, but as a challenge. Some nights, he dreamed it moved. He would wake certain that he had seen it shift, a faint tilt, a tiny turn toward him, though when he blinked, it was still. At times, it seemed heavier in the air, its presence pressing on the room like an unspoken threat. In those moments, it was unclear which ruled the other, the dying king or the gleaming circle of gold waiting for a new host. To the court, the crown was the ultimate prize. Behind the tapestries, they whispered of who might truly hold it in the years to come. Would Edward wear it in truth? Or would it be worn only in his name while the Seymours pulled the strings? Could Mary claim it if the realm's faith turned back to Rome? Could anyone, perhaps even a counselor, become the hand that placed it upon a head and, in so doing, become its master? But to Henry, the crown was not theirs to take. Not yet. Even as his body failed, he clung to it as though his very breath was tied to its golden frame. He had ruled for nearly 4 decades, and the crown had been constant. Through marriages and executions, through wars and treaties, through the break with Rome and the plunder of the monasteries. It had outlasted every friend, every enemy, and most of his bloodline. He could not imagine it resting anywhere but above his brow. And so, the rituals continued. Every morning, after the bandages were changed and the fevered sweat wiped from his skin, the crown was polished until it gleamed. It was placed where he could see it from his bed, its placement adjusted so that the candlelight caught it perfectly. Some days, he had it lifted and set upon his head, not for a ceremony, not for the court, but for himself. The weight was familiar. The cold press of gold against his temples was almost a relief. It was proof, to him if to no one else, that he was still king. But the crown had its own hunger. It was patient, but not eternal. In its history, it had rested on the heads of men who had conquered and been conquered, who had lived long and who had died young. It did not care for the man beneath it, only for the fact that there was a man. And soon, Henry sensed, it would have to be fed again. The fever deepened in the nights, blurring the edge between waking and dream. Sometimes he thought he saw hands, strange hands, lifting the crown away. He would wake then, his own fingers gripping the fur at his collar, his breath ragged. The crown would still be there, unmoved, but the vision lingered. His council noticed his fixation. They whispered about it when they thought him asleep. They wondered if his mind was slipping, if the fever had made him superstitious. But none dared remove it from his sight. Perhaps they feared his wrath. Or perhaps, like him, they understood that the crown was no longer just a symbol. It was a presence in the room, as much a part of the king's final days as the buzzing flies or the smell of vinegar. To those who visited him, the image was striking. A man dying, his skin pale, his body weakened. And beside him, the crown unchanging, untarnished, untouched by time. It was as if the two were locked in a final contest, each waiting for the other to give way. And outside his chamber, the contest was already decided in the minds of some. The crown would move on as it always had. The only question left, and the one that would shape the kingdom, was whose head it would choose to rest upon. The summons went out at dusk. Outside, the winter light was already fading, draining from the sky until only the dim orange of the palace torches broke the darkness. In the king's private chamber, the fire hissed and cracked in the grate, the smell of burning oak mixing with the ever-present tang of vinegar and rotting flesh. At the far end of the long gallery, footsteps approached, slow, deliberate, echoing against the stone floor in the stillness. The guards stepped aside without a word, their faces as blank as carved effigies. And into the chamber walked Thomas Cranmer, Archbishop of Canterbury, The air seemed to change the moment he entered. Cranmer was no stranger to Henry's rooms. He had attended the king in matters both political and spiritual for years. But this was different. This was not the confident monarch summoning his churchmen to debate theology or to sign some new decree. This was the call of a dying man, though whether Henry himself would admit, it was another matter. The chamber was dim, lit only by the glow of the fire and a scatter of candles that trembled in the cold draft creeping under the door. In the center, swathed in furs, the king lay propped against a mound of pillows. His skin was pale and waxy, his lips cracked, but his eyes still held that familiar, assessing sharpness. Tradition was clear. A king on his deathbed received the last rites: confession, absolution, and the anointing with holy oil, the rituals that eased the passage from life to death, ensuring the soul's safe arrival at the gates of heaven. But Henry had never been a man bound by tradition. Cranmer waited for him to speak. The crackle of the fire filled the silence, punctuated by the faint ticking of a clock somewhere in the shadows. At last, Henry's voice came, not strong, but steady. He did not ask for confession. He did not ask for prayers. He asked only one thing: "Hold my hand." The words hung in the air, simple yet heavy. Cranmer stepped forward, the polished boards groaning faintly beneath his weight. He took the king's hand, large, fleshy, the skin cool and damp. The fingers twitched once, as though testing his grip, and then settled. No words passed between them, not the familiar Latin formulas, not even the gentle assurances that a priest might offer the sick. Cranmer's lips were still, his eyes fixed on the king's face. Some who later told the tale swore that his lips did move, whispering a prayer so quietly it could not be heard. Others claimed he dared not speak, afraid that any mention of death or salvation might be taken as an insult, a challenge to the king's final illusion of command. For Henry was still the king, even here, even now. He had broken with Rome not to kneel before God, but to stand beside him, a monarch who ruled his church as well as his realm. To confess now, to plead for forgiveness, would be to admit imperfection, to acknowledge that even a king could be judged. And Henry had never tolerated the idea of judgment from anyone but himself. The silence between them grew long. The only sounds were the soft hiss of the fire and the muffled toll of bells drifting in from the city. Each note seemed to stretch as though time itself were slowing in this room. The light from the flames caught on the polished curve of the crown, still resting on the table nearby, throwing sharp glints onto the wall like watchful eyes. In that stillness, the court's most dangerous truth became clear. Henry would not go as a penitent. Cranmer's hand remained clasped with the king's, but his thoughts were his own. Perhaps he prayed silently for Henry's soul. Perhaps he thought of the years they had stood together. Through the Reformation, through the destruction of monasteries, through the rise and fall of queens. Perhaps he wondered whether he, too, would soon be caught in the shifting tides of power that would come when this hand grew cold. The courtiers who stood at the edges of the chamber, their faces lit by firelight, dared not move. Every flicker of the king's eyes, every shallow rise of his chest was studied like an omen. Outside this room, the whispers behind the tapestries had grown louder. Plans were already moving, alliances forming, the machinery of succession grinding into place. But here, in this pocket of heat and shadow, nothing moved but the flame and the slow, deliberate breathing of the king. It was a scene burned into memory. The dying monarch, the silent archbishop, and between them, the weight of everything that could not be spoken aloud. Some would later say that in those moments, Henry looked not like a man surrendering to death, but like one preparing to wrestle with it. His gaze was not distant or clouded, but fixed, as if daring even the Almighty to challenge his claim to power. No confession, no absolution, no yielding. It was an ending entirely in keeping with the life he had lived, for Henry had built his reign on control. Control over his court, his people, his church, even his God. To surrender that in his final hour would be to undo the myth he had spent decades crafting. Better to leave the world as he had ruled it, with his head unbowed, his hands still gripping the symbols of his authority, and his will imposed on those around him. The fire burned lower. Shadows stretched across the bed, swallowing the edges of the king's form. Cranmer did not move until the king's eyes began to close. Slowly, carefully, he released the hand and stepped back into the waiting dark. The courtiers exhaled as one, a breath they had not realized they'd been holding. That night, the palace understood something it had perhaps always known. Henry VIII would not die as a humble servant of God. He would die as a king, untamed, unrepentant, and certain of his place in the order of the world. And that refusal, that final act of defiance, would shape the myth of his death for centuries to come. Bridge to Chapter 9. Yet myths are fragile things. And outside the chamber's heavy doors, reality was already preparing to break in. Death was coming, and with it, a silence more absolute than even Henry's will could command. It happened quietly. No great cry, no trumpet blast to mark the passing of a king. Only the slow, uneven rise of his chest, and then the stillness. The fire in the grate hissed faintly. The candles shivered in their brass holders, and somewhere in the deep winter air, the tolling of a bell drifted in from the city, a sound meant for the hour, but which now felt like a mark upon history. Henry Tudor, King of England, was gone. For a moment, no one in the chamber moved. The courtiers who had been watching for hours, measuring the rhythm of his breathing, watching the faint twitch of his fingers, stood as if frozen in a painting. The physicians, their hands already sticky with the sweat of tending him, exchanged a glance that needed no words. And then, almost at once, the room shifted. This was not the time for mourning. Mourning would come later, in public, with black cloth draped over the palace gates and solemn processions through the city streets. For now, there was work, dangerous work. The first order was silence. The guards at the doors were instructed in low, firm voices. No one enters. No one leaves without permission. The servants were sent away in pairs, each sworn to keep their tongues still under threat of death. The windows were shuttered, as though the cold alone could carry the news beyond these walls. The king was dead, but no one beyond this chamber could be allowed to know. Why? Because in Tudor England, a monarch's death was more than a personal loss. It was a moment of peril. The instant a king's life ended, the machinery of succession began to grind forward, and in that fragile window before the new ruler was secured, a throne could be stolen. Henry's son, Edward, was still a boy, a child king whose rule would be shaped entirely by those who stood around him. And where there was a child on the throne, there were always wolves at the door. The council needed time to gather, to agree, to secure the seals and the regalia, to decide who would hold the reins until Edward was of age. And so the death became a state secret. The body lay where it was, the face composed by careful hands. Courtiers left the room and returned moments later with pens and parchment, drafting letters in Henry's name. Letters that would go out to ambassadors, to commanders, to every corner of the kingdom, as though the king still sat in his chair giving orders. In those letters, Henry was alive. He was ruling. He was watching. Meanwhile, other hands were at work. The bed was stripped, the soiled linens burned, the pillows replaced with fresh ones to cradle the head that would never lift again. The body was sponged with water warmed in copper basins, the skin drying to a faint waxen sheen. The rich nightshirt was changed for one of finer linen, as though for an audience that would never come. Over it all was laid the weight of silence, not the peaceful silence of rest, but the taut, listening kind that waits for footsteps in the corridor. Outside the chamber, life went on as though nothing had changed. In the kitchens, spits turned, meat roasted, wine was drawn from the casks. In the courtyards, horses were fed, and grooms swept the snow from the cobbles. London's markets bustled, the shouts of merchants rising into the air. The people moved through their day unaware that the man who had ruled them for 37 years now lay cold among the silks and shadows. This secrecy was not without danger. Every hour the truth was hidden, the risk grew. One careless word, one servant's glance too long at a closed door, and the whispers could escape. A whisper could become a rumor could become a spark. And in the Akawamri, volatile world of Tudor politics, sparks had a habit of finding powder. The guards doubled their watch. Trusted men were posted at the palace gates, tasked with controlling who came and went. Messengers were diverted, their errands reassigned. The palace became a body holding its breath. Inside the council chamber, the talk was cold and practical. Who would inform Prince Edward? How quickly could he be brought to London? Which factions could be placated, and which would need to be watched? How would they present the king's death to the people in a way that kept the realm calm and obedient? The answers were decided behind closed doors, far from the eyes of the court at large. The councillors spoke in low voices, each aware that the choices made in these hours would echo for decades. In the king's chamber, the body began its slow journey toward the next stage. It would not be buried yet. That would take weeks to arrange. The embalming was begun in secret, the scents of herbs and resins mingling with the lingering odor of decay. The face was smoothed, the hands folded, rings were removed and stored away. The Great Seal of England was locked in its case. At night, candles were kept burning so that the room was never fully dark. Perhaps it was respect. Perhaps it was fear. Some of those who entered the room in those days later said it felt less like the king had died than like he was waiting. Waiting for some final command, some final act. The crown still sat nearby, untouched, its gold catching the flicker of the flames. Even in death, it was clear that Henry's reign was about control. He had kept the reins in his hands until the very last breath. And now, even with his body cooling, the machinery of secrecy and order moved as though he had willed it himself. The deception could not last forever. Eventually, the letters would cease, the truth would have to be told, and the kingdom would mourn its king. But for now, the greatest power in England was not the living heir, nor the council, nor even the crown. It was the silence. And that silence, heavy and deliberate, was as much a part of Henry's legacy as the laws he had passed, the wives he had taken, or the heads he had sent to the block. He had ruled in life with an iron hand. In death, he ruled still. Through the fear, the secrecy, and the knowledge that even his passing would happen on his terms. Yet bodies, no matter how royal, do not keep their secrets long. And when Henry's coffin finally left Whitehall, the road ahead would carry a sight and a stench that no one in England would ever forget. It was deep in the night when the great doors of Whitehall finally opened. The torches lining the courtyard burned low, their flames guttering in the cold January wind. The guards shifted in silence, their breath hanging pale in the air. And then, with the slow rhythm of a ritual, the coffin was carried out. It was vast, heavy oak bound in iron, its seams sealed with pitch to keep the air and what was inside from escaping. Over it was draped black velvet, the cloth edged in gold thread that caught the torchlight like embers. Beneath that shroud lay the remains of Henry Tudor, the man who had ruled England for nearly 4 decades, the man who had made and unmade queens, and whose shadow had stretched across half of Europe. But the body inside was not the golden prince of memory. The January cold bit hard, but it was not enough to halt what had already begun. Even before the coffin was lifted, The physicians had smelled it, the sweet, sickly odor of decay that no amount of resin, herbs, or ceiling pitch could fully mask. Death had been patient in coming, but now it was working quickly. The flesh was breaking down, the gases building in the hollowed chambers of the king's body. The coffin rocked slightly as it was lifted, the pallbearers grunting under its immense weight. They moved slowly, the wood creaking in its bindings, the iron handles biting into their gloved hands. The procession wound out of the palace gates and into the darkened streets. No bells rang, no trumpets sounded. The journey would be made in silence, under the cover of night, away from the eyes of a city that still did not officially know its king was gone. Only the sound of boots on frozen ground marked the passage of the cortege. Snow crunched softly beneath them, the black horses stamping and tossing their heads against the bite of the air. The moon followed them between clouds, casting the velvet in a dull silver glow. Their route took them north, toward Sion Abbey, a resting place for the night before the journey continued to Windsor, where Henry's tomb awaited beside Jane Seymour. Inside the Abbey's great hall, trestles had been prepared. Candles burned high in iron stands, their light throwing long shadows up the stone walls. The coffin was laid down with care, the velvet still in place, the seal of the crown fixed to its lid. The men bowed their heads and left the hall in silence, closing the heavy doors behind them. The coffin was alone. By morning, it was no longer alone in the way they had left it. When the first to enter stepped inside, he stopped short. A dark stain had spread across the flagstones beneath the trestles. It was thick, almost black in the candlelight, and it gleamed with an unmistakable sheen. The smell hit next, not the faint incense from the chapel, but the raw, metallic tang of blood. The pitch and resin seals had failed. The pressure within had found a way out. From some hidden crack along the coffin's underside, the fluids of the king's body had escaped, dripping steadily through the night until they pooled on the cold stone floor. The whispers began immediately. Some said it was divine justice, the blood of those he had condemned, returning to mark him even in death. They spoke of Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, of the monks cast from their monasteries, of the countless nameless men and women who had been crushed beneath the machinery of his will. Others swore they had seen dogs enter the hall in the early dawn, lapping at the dark puddle before being driven out. Whether truth or invention, the story spread like fire through dry straw, growing with each telling until it became a vision of poetic retribution. The hounds of the earth feeding on the remains of a king. At the abbey, the scene was cleaned quickly, the flagstones scrubbed until the stain was gone. The coffin was checked, resealed, the velvet smoothed once more. The official story was simple: a fault in the wood, nothing more. But no amount of scrubbing could erase what had been seen. In Tudor England, symbols mattered. And this, a coffin leaking its contents onto holy ground, was not a symbol anyone could ignore. For those who had feared him in life, it was a sign that the spell was broken. For those who had hated him, it was confirmation that God had marked him at last. And for those who still served him, it was a reminder that even the most absolute ruler was subject to the same slow, humbling decay as any other man. By dusk, the procession was ready to move again. The coffin was lifted once more, the trestles left bare. The abbey's doors closed behind them, the echoes of their footsteps fading into the night air. The journey to Windsor would be longer, but the secrecy was no longer as perfect as it had been. Word had already slipped through the cracks, not the plain truth of the king's death, but the far more dangerous truth of the omen on the road. In the taverns and marketplaces, the whispers grew louder. The king was dead, they said, and his body had burst like an overripe fruit. The hand of God had struck him down and made a public example of him. Such was the paradox of Henry's life, and now his death. He had fought to control every narrative, every image, every judgment of his reign. Yet in the end, the most enduring image would be one he could not command. A coffin, leaking in the night, its black velvet hiding a secret that could not be sealed away. And so the cortege pressed on, the sound of the horses' hooves dull against the frozen ground, the coffin swaying slightly with each step. Inside, the man who had once been the axis around which England turned lay in silence, his flesh returning to the earth in slow betrayal. The black velvet rippled in the wind, the gold thread catching the moonlight like the last glint of a fading crown. And while the body moved toward its final rest, the crown had already found a new head. In London, a boy king had been proclaimed, and the men around him were wasting no time in shaping a realm in their own image. But the shadow of the dead king would not fade so easily. The bells began before dawn. They rang not with the slow, mournful rhythm of a funeral, but with the sharp precision of proclamation. In the cold morning air of London, their sound cut across the rooftops, startling pigeons from the eaves, and carrying down every crooked street. By mid-morning, the news was everywhere. Edward, son of Jane Seymour and Henry VIII, was now King of England, 9 years old, thin as a reed, pale as parchment. A boy who still needed help mounting a horse, now burdened with a crown that had outlasted stronger men. The coronation proclamations were read aloud in the marketplaces, the heralds' voices bright with formality. The words were meant to inspire loyalty and unity, but they carried something else as well. The faint but unmistakable echo of absence. For all the fanfare, everyone knew the truth. The real power did not sit on the boy's head. The council gathered in the great hall, the air thick with breath and candle smoke. They had been waiting for this moment, some for months, others for years. The regency was theirs to shape, and shape it they would. But Henry was still in the room, in spirit, if not in flesh. His name was spoken again and again, invoked like a weapon or a shield, depending on the speaker's need. This is what His Majesty your father would have wished. Your father's policy in France must be maintained. Your father would never have tolerated such leniency. The boy sat straight in his chair, listening, but the voices around him were those of men who saw in him not a sovereign, but an empty vessel to be filled. In the streets, the talk was different. Merchants remembered the fat years when Henry's court had spent lavishly, and the lean years when his wars drained the kingdom's coffers. Fishermen spoke of new taxes that had driven them to near ruin. Priests muttered about the king who had stripped the monasteries bare, taking chalices and candlesticks as though robbing a church were no sin at all. And yet, even among the bitter, there was awe. Henry had been a king of presence. When he entered a room, it was as if the walls themselves bowed. That kind of memory lingered. And now, with a boy on the throne, the memory was sharper, the absence louder. Edward's first acts as king were not his own. Every letter, every decree, every proclamation passed through the hands of his council before it reached the seal. Decisions were debated in chambers where the boy's voice was rarely the final one heard. But the men behind him were not of one mind. The Seymours, his mother's kin, pushed for their dominance in the regency. Others eyed the religious question: should England press further into Protestant reform, or soften toward the old Catholic ways? Each faction wrapped itself in the shroud of Henry's ghost, claiming to know his will better than the others. The irony was bitter. Henry had built a monarchy in which all power flowed from the crown, and now that same crown sat upon the head of a child, becoming less a symbol of authority and more a prize to be fought over. In private, some wondered if Edward would grow into his father's strength. Others doubted he would live long enough to find out. The boy's health was delicate, his frame slight, and the weight of the gold circlet seemed more burden than honor. Yet, the crown itself seemed unchanged. It still gleamed in the candlelight, its rubies and sapphires catching fire with every flicker of the flame. It still rested on its crimson cushion with the same air of inevitability. To those who sought power, it was the only thing that mattered. But the crown carried more than jewels. It carried blood. The memory of Anne Boleyn's last breath, the cries from the monasteries as their doors were torn from their hinges, the trails of smoke from the pyres of heretics. It was a crown steeped in both splendor and ruin, and no matter how young or innocent the wearer, it could not be washed clean. The people felt it. At the proclamation in Cheapside, the crowd cheered for their new king, but their eyes darted to the men flanking him. They knew where decisions would be made, and it was not in the boys' chamber. In the alehouses, toasts were made to Edward, but the conversations slid quickly back to Henry. Say what you will. He kept the French afraid of us, and emptied our pockets doing it. Aye, but he was a king. That last word hung heavy. A king, not a boy playing at one. In the weeks that followed, the council began to reshape the realm in earnest. Reforms were passed, alliances tested, old enemies courted. Yet, for every step forward, there was a glance backward, toward the great looming figure who had filled the throne before. Some policies were kept purely because they bore Henry's stamp. Others were overturned with quiet satisfaction, the councillors claiming that times had changed. But through it all, Henry's reign remained the measuring stick. His ghost, unburied in the minds of the court, still sat at the head of the table. For Edward, the lesson came quickly. The crown was not freedom. It was a tether, one that bound him to the past as tightly as it bound him to the present. Every choice he made was weighed against the unspoken question, what would your father have done? And so the boy learned to wear two faces. In public, the solemn mask of kingship, speaking words drafted for him, receiving the homage of nobles twice his age. In private, the quiet eyes of a child still finding the shape of the world. The kingdom, too, wore two faces. Outwardly, it celebrated the dawn of a new reign. But beneath the surface, it was still Henry's England. A realm built on ruthless foundations, where power was taken, not given, and where the past was never truly past. The shadow of the dead king stretched over every hall, every council chamber, every law. It was a shadow that no candle could banish. And shadows, if left too long, begin to rot. For all crowns must pass, but when a crown is soaked in blood, it leaves stains on the throne, on the realm, and on the history that remembers it. The wind moves differently over Whitehall now. Where once there were courtyards alive with the clatter of hooves and the glint of sunlight on armor, there is only air, open, empty, unbound by walls that no longer stand. The great palace is gone, claimed by fire and time, its stones scattered into the centuries. But the stories remain. They hang here still, invisible yet heavy, as though the past itself refuses to let go. And in those stories, Henry does not rest. History has not softened his end. No chronicler has been able to polish away the smell of that sick room, the sound of flies buzzing over the royal bed, the image of a king swollen with his own stubbornness. The final weeks of Henry VIII were not just the end of a reign. They were the anatomy of decay, played out in slow, merciless detail for those trapped within Whitehall's walls. The sores that festered on his legs were only the most visible wounds. Beneath the surface, other kinds of rot had long been working their way through the kingdom. Every whispered conversation behind a tapestry, every false smile at a council table, every alliance struck not in loyalty, but in anticipation of his death. These were the symptoms of a court that had learned to survive a tyrant by becoming part of the disease. And in those final days, it was impossible to tell where the king's body ended and the body of the realm began. Both were breaking down. Both reeked of inevitability. Yet, for all this, Henry's will did not bend. Even as his strength failed, he gripped at power like a drowning man clutching driftwood. He dictated orders from his bed. He stared down the crown on its table as though daring it to leave him. He refused confession, refused repentance, refused the softening that so often comes to men on the edge of death. In this, he embodied the paradox of monarchy itself, that a crown can lift a man above every other soul in his realm, make him law, make him legend, and yet it cannot shield him from the same end that claims beggars and thieves. When the king was gone, the rot did not vanish with him. Edward inherited the throne, but he also inherited a court trained in deception, a council adept at dressing self-interest in the language of loyalty. Henry's England was not built for peace. It had been shaped by fear, sharpened by executions, cemented by the knowledge that to challenge the crown was to risk the block. Those habits did not die with the man who had forged them. They simply changed hands. And beyond the court, the people lived in the shadow he left behind. They remembered the weight of his taxes, the ruin of the monasteries, the years of war. They remembered the feasts, the pageantry, the sheer theater of his reign. They remembered the wives, not just their names, but the way each story had ended. Some spoke of him with awe, others with bitterness, but few with indifference. Henry VIII had been too large for that. Today, Whitehall's walls are dust and memory, yet the scent of that sick room lingers in the imagination. That sour mix of sweat, infection, burning herbs, and candle wax. It is a smell that belongs to no single time, because it is the smell of power in its decline. It seeps into the stone. It seeps into history. It waits. For power, like the body, is always dying, even in the moment it appears most alive. A crown is not a shield. It is a weight. It presses down on the flesh beneath it, leaving a mark that no successor can hide. And when that flesh begins to fail, the weight only grows heavier until both man and metal are pulled down together. Henry's last days are proof that the trappings of kingship, the gold, the ceremony, the obedient voices, mean nothing to the forces that work from the inside out. And yet, there is something in that refusal to bow that still captures the imagination. He would not confess. He would not repent. He would not let the crown leave him before his final breath. In a world where kings were meant to kneel before God, Henry left this one last defiance, as though daring heaven itself to argue with him. It is grotesque. It is fascinating. It is unforgettable. In the corridors of power, the lesson is not lost. Every generation produces its own crowns, its own masters, its own carefully guarded rooms where decisions are made behind closed doors. And in each of those rooms, somewhere, the rot is beginning, invisible at first, then spreading until it becomes impossible to ignore. Henry's story is a reminder that this is not new. It has always been this way. His Whitehall is gone. His body is dust. His reign is an entry in the history books. But the structures he built, fear, ambition, secrecy, are far harder to bury. They lie dormant, like embers beneath ash, waiting for the right wind to stir them back into flame. And when the next man, or woman, bold enough to wear the crown steps forward, the weight will settle on their head as it did on his. The gold will shine, the jewels will glitter, and beneath it all, the rot will be waiting. Closing line. For in the end, the crown does not belong to the king. The king belongs to the crown, and the crown belongs to the rot.